I want to take us into some especially tricky work today. To get ready for that, you can think of your favorite book or movie. It can be something recent or a childhood favorite, like I'm thinking of Narnia. As soon as you have an idea, just jot it down in your reading notebook. Now, will you think about who that story is mostly about? Who does the story follow most closely? And are there any scenes without that character? Like, I'm thinking of Narnia, and I feel like the story mostly follows Lucy. She's the main heroine of the four kids. But I seem to remember that there are scenes she's not in, like when Edmund goes off with the White Witch and gets in all that trouble. What about the favorite stories you're thinking of? Who do they mostly follow, and is that character in every scene? It's interesting to think about, isn't it? I'm pretty sure that Triss tells the story in Divergent, so she must be in every scene, but I kind of want to go check. And I'm also wondering if they changed it for the movie. Interesting. I kind of want to check that too. And I'm pretty sure Harry isn't in every scene in Harry Potter, but I'm wondering why and if that's true for the movie only or also in the book. And then there's also some tricky books that seem to follow multiple characters. To find out more about this, you need to go back to these stories and look right from the start at who is telling the story. If you did that, you'd realize that who is telling the story matters because it has a tremendous impact on how the reader experiences the story. Readers, today I want to teach you that sometimes the reader hears a story through the voice of one character, and then everything is shaped by that character's point of view. Other times, the reader gets a wider point of view, seeing scenes that the main character isn't in. One way readers investigate point of view is to look closely at how the story begins. Readers, I want you to have one of your author study books that you might be reading later in the unit so that we can investigate this further. Pause the video and make sure you have a book in front of you. Now that you have a book to investigate, will you have these questions in mind as you skim the first one or two pages? And be ready to think about it and jot notes as you're reading. Who is telling the story, and how do we as readers know? Go ahead and pause the video and do this work. Sometimes readers struggle to describe the point of view, and it's because there is some expert vocabulary that you need. I'm going to give you some terms. They are terms for what's called type of narration, which is a fancy way of saying whose point of view the story presents, who is telling the story. I want you to try to match one of these types of narration to your book. Pay attention to the pronouns. Does it begin with I, or does it begin with characters' names and pronouns like he and she? The pronouns will give you a clue if a character is a narrator or if it's a third person narrator. Pause the video for a few minutes while you do this work with the first few pages of your book. Okay, readers, now we're going to get even trickier. When you encounter first person narration, here's a tip. That means you'll want to stay alert for how everything you learn is filtered through this character's point of view. Great writers, like the ones you're reading, sometimes lay out tiny clues for the reader that show the narrator has a bias or partial point of view. You can look for how full or how partial that point of view is. And you're realizing that when the story begins with he, she, or they, it's probably in the third person, and you're going to get more of a bird's eye view. Here's a tip for when you encounter a story in third person. That means you'll want to stay alert to who the story mostly follows. And if the story leaves that character, pay attention. It's probably for a reason. Often, when authors insert a scene the character is not in, it's because they are giving the reader a window into other perspectives and filling in some important information. Readers, let's review the work that you're doing so that you can continue it in the stories you're reading this week, the novels you begin next week, and any narrative. Essentially, you paid close attention to the start of the story, asking these questions. Who seems to be telling the story at the start? What pronouns help the reader figure out the point of view? And how full or partial is the narrator's point of view? Readers, this work is going to be interesting in your short stories, and I imagine even more interesting in the novels you'll soon be reading. For today, will you take a moment to consider what you want to work on during your private reading? Are you starting another story? If so, perhaps you'll want to reread the beginnings of the first two stories you read and compare the narrative points of view. Or do you need to get a lot of reading done, and it makes more sense to read on, getting many pages read today? Take a moment to think about your work, and then off you go.